A bit of backstory. I grew up in a rural part of Ireland with only two neighbors. I lived in my great-grandparents' old small farm and had renovated the old barn into a garage for my dad to work as a mechanic. My closest neighbor was my dad's aunt-in-law who never really bothered us. But our other neighbor, we let them use our lane as an easy access point to their house and farm, even though the other lane going down to theirs was a much shorter method, but a tight road for a milk tanker and a silage harvester. I had a large extended family of 14 or so cousins who were always at my house hanging out. And two of my cousins who I was really close with, let's call the older one Mick and the younger one Jim, befriended the neighbor's middle child. We'll call him George, as his family was always looking up to my dad to fix something, and George was always tagging along. We had so much fun together as kids, but everything got so much weirder as we grew up. George was about 14 when this started to happen. One day when I was about 16 years old, the neighbors needed their Jeep fixed, and when George was dropping it off for his dad, he had realized that my parents weren't home and noticed the back door was unlocked, so instead of knocking and calling our names, he walked into the house and up the stairs to my bedroom, where I was sleeping. He opened my bedroom door and just stared at me while saying my name very quietly. I woke up confused as to what was going on. My family were loud and rambunctious, so someone quietly saying my name was definitely not normal. I asked what the heck he was doing there, and his excuse was, no one was downstairs and I had heard voices upstairs. The voices were my TV playing as I fell asleep. I passed it off as it was nothing and just got him out of my house as soon as I could. Thankfully, I was dressed so I wasn't freaking out about him seeing me. When he left, I went down to my sister's room on the bottom floor and asked her if she had heard George knock or come in. She was sitting there doing schoolwork and didn't hear a sound, just the Jeep driving up, which is normal for my dad's family to use the garage. They all had keys to it, as it was where the farming machinery was kept when not needed, so she thought nothing of it. Another incident involving George was when my cousins Mick and Jim had invited me to come hang out with us and play some video games. Everything was fine that day until later in the evening when Mick went to the bathroom, and 2 minutes later, George disappeared after him. Not long later, Mick came back and I asked had he seen George. He hadn't. And then I heard the floorboards creak from my bedroom, and as no one else was upstairs, so I was confused, and I went up to see when I found George in my closet snooping through my stuff. I grabbed him by the collar and I pulled him out of my room. I was furious as no one was allowed in my room. I was a 17-year-old, 5'0" noodle of a girl that had Asperger's syndrome and a bad mental health record. So to me, my room was my sanctuary. His excuse again was, I was looking for Mick and I thought he was up here. I was at this point screaming at him to never come near me or my room again, and about how creepy this all was. All the while he kept laughing like it was a joke, and for me, it wasn't. He was refusing to leave, so I did the only thing my dumb brain could think of doing, was to put him on his butt and drag him out myself. By whatever way I swiped his feet, he fell onto his butt and slid down the stairs, which as a boy who was at least 6 feet tall and weighed twice as much as me, astounded my cousins and parents, who all came running to the bottom of the stairs and found him on his bottom, crying. My family were extremely confused but stayed calm and asked us both what had happened. Surprisingly, he told them what he had told me and never made me out to be the bad guy. When I came downstairs about 5 minutes later, after a small cry, my family asked for me to recall of the events and never punish me, but asked George to never come to the house again without my dad's knowledge, and if he does, we will not let them use our lane anymore, as legally they had no right to use it. George never stepped foot into the house again, but would always speed down our road in anything he was on, whether it was a tractor or a Jeep. He even ran over our dog in his quad. I had a lot of younger family members all over the time. We did think about putting up a gate, but the road in Huge Street was too wide, unless we cemented a post in the middle of the road. But he didn't care. He would purposefully drive the tractor past our lane at 2 or 3 in the morning, turning at the top of our lane. Instead, we put a cattle guard at the point where our lanes meet their land. That made no difference, so my dad now had to park a vehicle, which is nearly always his transit van, in the middle, so they'd purposefully have to slow down to go around it. This all happened about 4 years ago, and I barely seen him since. But I moved out and into my own place with my boyfriend, who happened to go to school with George. My boyfriend was a few years older, but George was the same age and in the same class as my boyfriend's younger brother. I had heard from them that when George was 17, he was FaceTiming an 8-year-old girl and was doing stuff while talking to her. The younger girl's mother walks in and sees what he's doing and files a police report, puts it on Facebook, photos of the interaction that they had and all. He is now, from what I heard, on probation and has an ankle tag. What a creep. I used to ride a motorcycle as a sole method of transportation when I was studying, and I used to work on hotel cocktail bars during the summer holidays. About 6 years ago, I was working at a historic, stereotypically grand hotel in a very rural area of the UK. I worked a long afternoon and evening into the night, finished cleaning up the bar around 2 a.m., and walked through the underbelly of the hotel to retrieve my motorcycle and make my journey back home. I can still clearly remember the feeling of the crisp night air and the absolute pitch-black silence of the countryside after the hot and seemingly never-ending nights of serving drinks to dinner-goers and party-goers. It was always sort of intensely relaxing. Not that being an adult meant not being scared of the dark or being outside on a motorcycle in the middle of nearly nowhere at 2 a.m. Riding through the local town took me a few minutes before I left to follow the dark country roads home. At this point, I rode a Honda 125cc, around 11 horsepower. Basic and old, but clean, and it did the job, regardless of its quirks such as the dim headlight, which would dim and flicker even more when coming to a stop. I was riding along these pitch-black roads with fields and woods surrounding me, very much alone for around 20 minutes. And then I saw a brief blast of bright blue headlights in my mirrors coming from behind. Moments later, dazzling headlights arrived behind me in seconds. Almost immediately, a large Range Rover pulls out to overtake me, blasting past barely inches away from me. I respond with a long blast on my horn. Big mistake. The Range Rover pulls over in front of me and slams on the anchors, in what seemed like an attempt to have me lose control under sudden braking, or to rear-end him. Bikes can, even when they're old and rely on drum brakes, stop pretty quickly. So I didn't rear-end the maniac in front. I came to a controlled stop. I see the door of the Range crack open, and a figure begin to step out. I went for it, using all 11 horsepower of the little Honda's power pulling an overtake. However, in those moments, this anger-crazed maniac had shut his door and stepped on the accelerator, causing us to be level and accelerating together when I had reached his car. He then started to run me off the road, pulling to the right, wedging me further over toward the ditch at the side of the road. This is where I ended up, struggling to control the bike on the wet, dewy heavy grass around the side of the road, trying to stop the 140-kilogram motorcycle dropping into the ditch. I struggled to regain balance, but I managed to pull the bike back onto the road. At this point, I noticed the guy had got back out of the Range Rover and walked around to the back, opened it, and was reaching inside. I had turned the bike to face the other side of the road, ready to turn either way and make an escape from the escalating situation. Just as I looked to turn, I took one more look over at him, to see him pulling a large, long object out of the back of the range. I just went for it, and taking another glance over my shoulder after 200 meters to see he had begun to continue driving up the road away from where I had run off the road. I slowed down to see what he would do next, after driving away from me. He reached the top of the road and pulled over to the left, waiting for me, the lights reflecting on the road. It was freaking eerie. My heart was beating so fast, yet it felt like time had stopped. I just carried on in the opposite direction, to find an alternate route home in the pitch black. Just before doing this, I checked my phone for signal, to see that I had no mobile coverage at all. On my first summer back home from my freshman year of college, I picked up a part-time job delivering pizza in a town around 30 minutes away from where I lived. The area, in rural Georgia, is known for having places that are in the middle of nowhere, and the pizza place's whole shtick was that it delivered to even to the most remote areas imaginable within the town limits. I could fill books with the weird experiences that summer, from the call that came from a long-abandoned warehouse to the dog that got excited about the pizza in my hand and accidentally shredded my pants with her claws. But one will always stand out in my mind as the creepiest. It was getting fairly late at night, around 10:30, so I was confident at the time that I would be sent on no further calls before closing at 11. However, someone barely managed to miss the cutoff time, and our clerk accepted their order since they were so close. I was given the address and a single box of hot dough and sent on my merry little way. The first red flag was the driveway, or rather the lack thereof. There was a mailbox but no actual driveway, not even gravel. It was really just grass, and a barely distinguishable trodden pathway that resembled more of a service trail than it did something frequently used. I bumped along, wondering if I was even en route to the place, when I saw a slightly above average sized house coming over the horizon, horribly dilapidated and completely surrounded by overgrown woods. I guesstimated where the rest of the driveway led, and ended up parking in a grassy patch that could have been the walkway just as easily as it could have been the front yard. Headlights aimed towards the porch as per company policy. I walked up to the door, but I believe that calling it a door is generous. It was a door frame, alright, but the door itself was just a large slab of wood, propped haphazardly against the side of the house, barely covering the entrance. This was red flag number 2. The third and fourth red flag were also on the door. This included the A4 sheet of printer paper with the words, "Around back," scribbled in all caps, which was hanging just below the place where somebody had self-engraved the door with the title, Manson Family Ranch. Typically, I would never go around to the back of a house, especially a shady unlit house, and especially at night. However, it was my last drop of the day, and I was ready to get it over with and be on my way home. Against my better judgment, I went around to the back of the house. The door back there was an actual door, but it was covered in both cobwebs and fresh spiderwebs. Clearly this was a door that had not been used in some time. I found the cleanest area available and knocked. I counted to 45 and knocked again. There were no lights on in the house, and I could hear no movement from inside. I knocked and counted again, and repeated the sequence 3 more times before I was finally creeped enough to decide to return back to my car. As I turned, I finally heard a voice coming from inside the house, clearly agitated, but I couldn't tell what they were saying. I tried to knock one more time, and as I was counting, I heard something in the woods behind me. It started out as just movement deep in the trees, but soon enough, I could make out distinct running footsteps coming directly towards me through the brush. As I'm standing there, coming to terms with my impending demise, I followed the direction of the noise to the edge of the woods, which is around 15 feet away from me. In the moonlight, I could clearly see the woman who had stepped out. She was relatively old, in her 60s I would guess. She had long blonde gray hair, which was tangled and matted and hung down past her hips. She was in what looked to be originally a white nightgown, but at the time it was dingy and closer to a beigeish brown color. She was absolutely barefoot, and her feet were covered in dirt and what had to be blood, presumably due to the fact that she had just sprinted through the prickly woods, where there was no trail to be seen. I never learned her name, but I still affectionately refer to her as Red Flag Number 5. She stopped short when she saw me, and started to shake her head no with her eyes wide. I stood there like a terrified deer in the most messed up headlights ever, as she took a few more steps towards me, reaching out to me finger pointed. Her voice came out way stronger than mine would have at the time when she spoke. You know how southern people can either sound like loving grandmothers or backwoods killers? Well, she sounded like the latter when she drawled. "Oh, no, 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 no. No, honey, no. You get on, you get on out of here." I wish I could say that I listened. I ran, I laughed. But I was so in shock at how the events were playing out that my own self-preservation was put on the back burner, while I tried to figure out just what in the Kentucky Fried F was happening. She seemed to realize that I was not moving, even if I could not make my mouth move to ask her what was happening, or even what to do with the stupid pizza in my hands. She looked at me like she could have smacked the heck out of me right then and there, and proceeded to deliver Red Flag Number 6 through 12. "Darling, did you hear me? You deaf or dumb? Young girls like you come out here and then they don't get to leave." So, I finally quit being the dumb person in a horror movie when I realized that this was not a funny little ghost story. This was a 5'3", 116-pound me, potentially being targeted to be robbed or kidnapped, or worse. So I dropped the dumb little pizza, which had serious serial killer toppings by the way, and started running back to my car, which I had stupidly left on and unlocked, as was usual for most of my deliveries. As I neared the car, I heard a slam from behind me, and I looked over my shoulder to see that the wooden door had been pushed over and had fallen into the porch beneath it. As I was closing the car door, an older man was limping down the front steps, waving his arms like an airplane runway attendant at me, calling me a little bee, telling me to get out of the car right now. At a loss for what to do, I called out something muttery and shaky, and along the lines of, "Pizza's out back." I floored my dad's crappy little 90s Lexus and somehow managed to avoid trees on the out trail back to the main road, which was still 12 miles and several turns from any road that actually had a name, let alone painted lines. I reported it to my manager, and he said that he contacted police, but nothing ever came of it that I'm aware of. Either way, that was my first and hopefully last personal encounter with the self-proclaimed Manson Family Ranch.